Hello everyone. At this time we'd like to go through the installation, the startup, some basic troubleshooting, and maintenance of a McGuire vertical storing level. And you can see it gets its name from the way that it stores vertical. When you receive your leveler prior to installation, they're going to arrive on a flatbed trailer, which you'll have to offload. Once they're offloaded, they're going to be laying on the drive or in the building with the deck side facing down, which means you're going to have a lifting device, which will be placed on the two provided lifting lugs that will come attached to the lip. I use a jib boom attachment that goes onto my fork truck, at which point you attach the hook to the two lifting lugs that are provided, lift it up in the air, and carefully swing it into place. When you receive your leveler, the hydraulics will not be connected. This cylinder will be fully retracted. This maintenance prop will be folded up inside the deck area. The red bars will be down, as you see. The pins will be placed on the vertical, which will have to be removed prior to installation. Once you have the leveler raised in place, typically it's done from the outside of the building. There's a rare occasion where you may have to do it from the inside of the building. Either way, it's pretty much the same installation process. What you'll do is you'll swing the vertical into place. You'll lower it down into place, at which point the hinge areas on the platform will swing down into the embedded tube elements of the vertical. At that point, when you get it to that area, you can insert your rear hinge pins. Make sure that you grease your rear hinge pins prior to installation. It just makes it easier down the line. When I do my installation, I like to start at one side and work my way over with the pins. If you try and put the center pin in first, it makes it difficult to get the rear or the outside in case there's a little bit of workage in the platform and or the indent of the vertical itself. Once you have the pins in place, make sure you insert the cotter pins and bend them over, at which time you can now take this prop loose and connect it. Once you have that connected, you can install the maintenance bolt that's in there, or maintenance pin, latch it in place. At that point, with the red bar still down, and it can remain down the entire time during the installation, you can safely lower the lip. Because the hydraulics are still not connected, the lip is going to lower on you, and you can safely disconnect your lifting device. As we're doing the installation, when you initially bring this leveler and swing it back into place and slowly lower it down to where the tubes line up, you can't have the vertical straight up and down when you lower it into the indent tubes. You actually want to take it slightly tilted forwards, like maybe 5 degrees. That way there's no binding issues in the rear hinge line, which will allow you better access for the pins. Once your leveler has been completely installed, it's now up to the electricians to have it powered. Once power is received to your leveler, you can do what we call the startup portion of your installation process. You can see on this particular leveler we have what is called a remote mounted power pack. If you have a remote mounted power pack, that needs to be filled with oil first, have all your hoses run before you do any of your startup procedure. Once you have the appropriate amount of oil in, you can bleed your system. As I said before, the hydraulics are going to be fully retracted. The lip is going to be closed. You simply use your push button station on your control box to extend the cylinder, retract the cylinder, extend the cylinder, retract the cylinder. We do that several times to bleed the air out of the system. The first time that you initially extend this ram, do not fully extend it. Go up maybe halfway and retract it. If you extend it fully the first time, there's a chance you could do what we call airlock the system. In that case, it's hard to bleed back out. We do have full pictures and explanations of startup in our owner's manual, which can be found on the website of the vertical. It's always a good thing before you go do a startup to reference the manual, just to get a little heads up of what you're going to encounter. Once you're starting to bleed this system, there's a flow control valve on top of the hoist cylinder. That's preset from the factory at a certain position. There's a little set screw in there that locks it in place. What I do is loosen the set screw, take the stem of that valve, open it up counterclockwise, 3 or 4 turns. What that does is allow you to get the air to the system faster. You can do your extending, retracting at a much faster rate. Once you have it bled completely, 6 or 7 times fully, in, out, in, out, in, out, you can close your flow control back up, open it up maybe a quarter turn. At this point, you'll extend your cylinder to full extension. At that point, you'll hear the pump go in pressure relief. When that pump goes in pressure relief, you can let off the button. At that time, you've got the rod of the cylinder fully extended. At this point, you can pin the cylinder in place. Now, to accurately pin that cylinder in place, what you want to do is have this freedom of movement here. You want, if you can imagine, there's a center line here where this pin is, and the rod eye of the cylinder, we reference this as the rod eye. You want the hole of that rod eye to be a half a hole below where it's physically mounted. So once you have that, and that can be achieved by adjusting the rod eye. There's a threaded rod eye that is recessed up inside the cylinder. If you need to lengthen the rod eye, simply unscrew it counterclockwise. If you need to shorten it, you go in clockwise with it. With the rod eye, there's a jam nut. Once you have the rod eye at a position a half a hole below the pinning hole, you'll have to raise the cylinder back up via the push buttons on the control box. What I do is usually raise it up substantially above where it's going to pin, and then you can do what we call henpeck the raise button to extend that cylinder very gently to the point where you can pin it in place. Once you can safely pin it in place where the holes are aligned, grease your pin, shove it in place, secure it with the rooming. You're going to see 2 different versions of this rod eye area. This is the old style version, we call it, and we have a new style version. You may run across both different scenarios, so they do the same purpose. Once you have that, it's pinned in place. You can safely start at one side. The red bars that I mentioned before are down. You can raise one red bar. I'm working from my left to right because the control box is on my right side. I would raise this red bar and take the pin out of the prop, put it in this mounting position. I would then go to the opposite side, take that red bar up, then I would run the leveler through its paces. Once you've got the cylinder finally pinned into place, make sure you come back, screw your flow control back in, deadhead it, bring it out a quarter turn, lock it back in place. At this point in time, you're ready to run the leveler. Remember, the lip is still going to be folded at this point, so what we want to do is, the red bars that I mentioned prior, you want to raise up this red bar, come to the center, take the pin out, go to the opposite side and raise that red bar. And I do that to keep myself safe at all times. I'm working toward my control box. This can be pinned where it belongs and latched in place. Pick up the other red bar. At this point, I'd go up to the control box and I'd lower the leveler. Lower the leveler to maybe 45 degrees. At that point, I would raise the lip because the lip is still pendant at this time. Anytime that you want to do a lip operation, it requires a 2-finger push button push. So if I want to lower the lip, it's a lip and lower button at the same time. If I want to raise the lip, it's a lip and raise push button at the same time. You'll see 3 push buttons on your control assembly. One will say raise, one will say lower, one will say lip. So anytime you want to do the lip, it requires 2 push buttons to be pushed. You want to take the leveler down all the way below dock, make sure it comes to rest. On your concrete, we actually have plastic pads here, but the leg stops need to come in contact fully with the concrete of your pit on both sides. Once you've gone below dock, you can raise the leveler back up. By keeping your finger mashed on the raise button, it'll come all the way up. There's a limit switch behind the maintenance prop. Once that limit switch is made, it shuts the pump and motor off. Once the pump and motor shut off, you can check to make sure that the prop is adjusted properly. Again, we have colored pictures and reference material in our manual depicting all of that. It's a real good source if you need to adjust something. Once that is done, your startup is pretty much complete, other than checking the oil again to make sure that you have at least 3 inches of oil below the top of the tank. We refer to this as being a remote mounted power pack. You'll also have what we call self-contained units, where in this area you have a reservoir. Up in this area, you have the pump and motor here. You have all your valving mounted here. In this case, all the hosing runs directly to the cylinders. In the case of a remote mounted power pack, as you can see by the plastic pipe, that's kind of a reference to what we do for remote mounted. Everything is done in the concrete wall behind the embed. Everything goes through plastic PVC, which means you have to run your hoses separately. Pay attention to how you run your hoses. The valve block is stamped accordingly, telling you which hose goes where. This is your lip cylinder. This is the hoist cylinder barrel end, or HB. This is the hoist cylinder rod end, which is HR. And those are all stamped on that valve block. This is the remote power pack I was referencing before when I was going through the vertical. And you can see on this vertical, or this remote power pack, this is the valve assembly I was referring to. This valve assembly could be a different configuration depending on vintage of the leveler. This is what we call the old valve block. You might see something different in the future. They all do the same thing. They make the vertical go up and down. This particular valve assembly has 4 different coils associated with it. The one that I'm pointing to now controls your lip function, whether it be to raise the lip or lower the lip. These 2 actually raise the leveler. There are no coils energized to lower your leveler, just to raise it. And this particular coil is what we call the float coil. The float means when it comes down off of its stored position to about 10 to 12 inches above dock, it goes into what we call the float mode. There's an actual mercury switch in the plastic J-box that's on the platform. When it gets to that height, 10, 12, 15 inches above dock, the switch turns on. It energizes this float coil. What that does is allow the cylinder, as the leveler sitting on the back of the truck, it allows that cylinder to float in and out, unobstructed, so it doesn't cause any damage to either the hoist cylinder or the rod eye associated with it. You'll see there is a valve assembly on the side of this. This is a pressure relief cartridge. What this does is give you system pressure. The best way to check the system pressure, to make sure you have optimum system pressure, take the vertical leveler all the way below dock with the lip fully extended, and you can back this out if you wish, push the button until the leveler just begins to raise. Once the leveler just begins to raise, go in 1 more full turn clockwise from that position. You also see that there's a jam nut on this as well. Tighten the jam nut once that's achieved. I'm going to touch on a few troubleshooting issues we may have with this certain valve block. If any of you guys are familiar with a spool valve is nothing but a garbage trap. So in the event that you get called out to a facility that has a vertical storing leveler and they tell you that something's not happening, whether the lip is not lowering, not raising, it's usually associated to either a spool valve or a bad coil. Bad coils do happen. They fail on occasion, especially if you're in a refrigerated warehouse that has ambient temperature coming into the building. There's no good way to check a coil with a meter, unless you have a very expensive meter that does milliohms. What you can do, though, is physically look at the coil. You can see if it's been swelled, blistered, cracked, or there's a distinct odor to one that's burnt out. Basically, what you want to do is just check all your coils to make sure that they're not too tight either. You want to be able to wiggle them back and forth just a little bit. If they become too tight, a spool valve, the stem of the spool valve is spring actuated. If you tighten up the jam nut too tight, inside that stem of the spool valve there's a spring. That's what actuates the motion of the spool valve. It's kind of like crushing a can. If you have the spool valve nut too tight, it actually crushes that stem, not allowing the spool valve to shift. So you want to be able to have just a little bit of freedom of movement in your coils. One other thing I always like to check also is the factor, the field wiring that's done by the electrician. If you found nothing wrong with anything on the valve body, I always check the wiring. If it's a new installation particularly, you can always bet or assume that something's been landed wrong, mislabeled, or not even connected. So that's another good thing to check. Another thing to check, your oil level once you're done. Make sure that your oil level is within 3 inches at the top of the power pack. We do use a specific grade of oil. All of our oils meet a MIL 5606, a military 5606 specification. You can reference our owner's manual. There are a number of different manufacturers that have that military 5606 spec, and they're all listed in our owner's manual. Once you're going through your installation process and that's done, you've run the leveler, I always like to check to make sure that the leveler is stored the way that it should be. We can store our levelers 5 to 8 degrees towards your overhead door. So as you can see, it's got a nice lean to it. It's leaning towards the door, and we can do that for a couple of different reasons. We have a dual acting hoist cylinder, so we always have fluid on both sides of the hoist cylinder. Not only do we have that, we have the over toggle knuckle prop that locks it into place. With that being said, that's what allows us to store this leveler 5 to 8 degrees towards the overhead door. I'd like to go through some of the maintenance areas on your vertical storing leveler. Not unlike the mechanical leveler we talk about, the vertical also has grease fittings on all of its hinge tubes. Make sure you grease the hinge tubes on the lip, down below, the center tube. All of the tubes on the platform itself will have grease fittings. Grease those. The yoke up on the lip cylinder, I like to spray some spray lube in there. And believe it or not, on top of this lip cylinder, there's a felt wiper ring. That needs to be oiled as well with some lubricating oil. Over time, if you don't use your lip, this has a tendency to dry out a little bit, and it can actually hold the lip up and prevent it from folding. The area in here, grease. There's a grease fitting underneath the hoist cylinder. I like to spray a little lube inside the hinge area of the hoist cylinder as well. One thing I forgot to mention right off the bat, whenever you're performing maintenance, do not be complacent. Drop your red bars. Put the pin through the prop. This prop is designed that if you have a shackled lock with a longer extension, you can actually put a lock through it and lock it out so that you're the only one that can be in there. If you don't have that, but I do recommend you have that, always make sure you put the pin in and lock it. But don't ever be complacent when you do maintenance on a vertical leveler. Make sure both red bars are down, the power is off and locked out, you have the pin in the prop. The pins that go through the prop, I like to spray lube them as well. Anything that has a rotating motion to it, throw some grease on it or some lubricating oil. You did grease the pin here before you put it together. It doesn't hurt to put some spray lube on that as well. That's basically all the areas that you need to grease or lubricate. I'd like to thank you for your time in watching this video. If you need any information on a McGuire vertical leveler, feel free to contact your local McGuire rep or your salesman in-house at McGuire.